So Hopkinsville, Edgar Cayce, 1877, born in a farming community called Beverly. His wife, Gertrude, born a little bit later in Hopkinsville. But Edgar really grew up in both of the towns. His family initially was in Beverly farming, but his father, Leslie, eventually gave that up and moved to Hopkinsville to pursue other lines of work. So during the time that Edgar and Gertrude were in Hopkinsville, it was changing pretty rapidly. It was a tobacco town, it was a rail town, and it was steadily growing. So 1880, just after Edgar's birth, the town had about 4,200 people here. By 1910, right before Edgar and Gertrude Cayce left, the town had doubled. It was 9,400. So in Hopkinsville, Edgar began his career as a photographer. He met Gertrude, the love of his life, and married. He lost a child here. He began doing his readings here, and he's buried here. So if Virginia Beach is the meat of the Cayce story sandwich, Hopkinsville is at least the bread and cheese. It really starts here and ends here. So we're going to switch gears and talk real quickly about what some sources are for historical research. I've divided it into a couple categories, and we're just going to go through this really quickly because I find it very interesting, but I know that not everybody probably does. So the first group of documents is government documents, and these help to really build the skeleton of a person's life in the historical record. So in these, we have census records, birth and death certificates, military drafts, marriage records, court records, and passports. And down here, we have Edgar and Gertrude's marriage record. So you can see I've highlighted Edgar Cayce's name in yellow. It's 1903. At that point, he was living in Bowling Green, which is about an hour east of us. He's 26 and working as a merchant. On Gertrude's side, it tells you where she's from, her age. It doesn't even have a category for her occupation because women were expected to not work during that time. So you can glean a lot of information from marriage records. This is an example of a death record, and it's Milton Porter Cayce, who was Edgar and Gertrude's one-year-old son who tragically died. And again, there's a lot of information that you can get off this document. You have his name at the top. You have that he's a baby, the date of his birth, how old he was when he died, his parents. And then for me, one of the saddest parts about this is the informant or the person who gave the information to whoever came to collect it. And it's his grandmother, Elizabeth Evans, Gertrude's mother. And you also have what he died from here, colitis, which was one of the readings, one thing mentioned in a reading that Yuki talked about earlier. And then we've got census records, which are really like the golden record. You can get a lot of information off of them. This is the 1900 US federal census record for the Cayce household up top and the Evans Salter household below. Here you can see the street they lived on. This is their address. You got Leslie Cayce and family. Edgar's right here. He's 23 at the time. You can see that he's a salesman. So the census runs in the US every 10 years. And if you have watched the news at all over the past 3 or 4 years, you've known that now there's a big political fight about what kind of questions go on the census. I don't know if that was the case in the early 1900s, but the questions do change with every census. So some of them are better from a historical perspective than others because they have more things that you're interested in learning about. Another group of records is records pertaining to place. These include city directories, deeds, maps, cemetery records. So the image over here is from the 1912 Hopkinsville City Directory, and you can see Edgar Cayce's here. He's working as a photographer. He lives on the south side of Russellville Road. They don't even have an address. He's east of the city limits, and he's married to Gertrude. This is a Sanborn map. It's a fire insurance company that started creating these maps for insurance purposes in the late 1800s. And these are like the best maps because the company basically went to every city and town in America and made them, and they give you a lot of information. So I picked this one because it's from 1906, but in 1910, this yellow circle on this house right here, that was Leslie and Sarah Casey's house. So you can see they've got this nice little wraparound porch. The fact that all of these are in yellow means that they're all built out of wood. If they're built, then it's very hard to see it, but you have 1.5 here, which means that the house is 1.5 stories tall. They've got an outbuilding in the back, which may have been an outhouse, if I had to guess. So there's a lot of information that you can also glean from these. But what really puts the flesh on the bones is biographical and family information. And this is always the hardest to come by. Newspaper articles, memoirs, biographies, diaries, and photographs. I would also argue that after going through a lot of the Cayce files, the information in that falls into this category because you have numerous letters that are written between Edgar and the people who he's trying to help, which provides so much information about their lives and the more intangible aspects of it, like how they're feeling emotionally and physically, what they're going through, what they're hoping for. And also the readings themselves, I think, fall into this category because many times I've found that the questions that people are asking Edgar are really like direct representations of how they're reflecting on their lives at the time. So between that and his photography, Edgar Cayce really provided historians with a lot of very, very useful information. So with that, we will jump on into our case studies. We've got 3 people who I'm going to just go through their life stories today and flesh them out with their actual historical documents that pertain to them in this life, and then what Edgar Cayce had to say about them, either in health readings or in life readings, or both, usually both. So the first person here is Estella Smith, better known as Cousin Teddie. She's one of Gertrude's cousins. The second person here in the middle, the baby, is Gray Salter, who's a nephew or cousin. He's another cousin of Gertrude's, and that's actually Edgar right there, a very young Edgar who's holding him on this emaciated calf. So both of these are Hopkinsville stories. And then the third person we'll talk about is Julia Chandler, who I don't think ever even came to Hopkinsville, but is a very, very interesting case study. So Estella Smith, Gertrude's cousin Estella, knew Edgar for most of her life. They met here in Hopkinsville probably around the time that Edgar started seeing Gertrude. And after the Cayces had left town, Estella continued to communicate with both Edgar and Gertrude through letters, continuing their friendship really through the rest of their lives. She dies around the same time as both Edgar and Gertrude. Estella received a number of readings from Edgar, including both a past life reading and numerous health readings that had to do with all of the ailments that she had, which included eye problems as well as a cancer that she really suffered with for over a decade, which eventually killed her. So Estella Smith's relationship with Edgar Cayce began in Hopkinsville, but her story didn't. Edith Estella Smith was actually born in Mascoutah, Illinois, on the 6th of May in 1880 to Alfred Porter and Carrie Porter Smith. Mascoutah is just a tiny little rail town. It had about 2,500 people in it at the time. And the railroad is actually what had brought her father there to begin with. He was the railroad agent for Mascoutah. Tragically, Cousin Teddie's mother died when she was about 3 years old, and Her father didn't really see much reason to stay in Mascoutah after that, and so he picked up his daughter and moved to Hopkinsville because his father was the railroad agent here. This is a big railroad family. Um, so once he got here, Alfred quickly met and married Kate Breathitt Salter, who was Gertrude's aunt. And so little Estella, known as Cousin Teddie, joined the extended Salter family, which would become her family for life, even though she never changed her last name. Kate and Alfred went on to have three sons, Porter, Eric, and Milton. Eric died when he was only 1 year old, and Alfred died not too long afterwards in 1891. So 1891, Estella is 11 years old. She has lost her biological mother and her biological father and a step brother as well as a baby. That's a lot of loss for an 11-year-old. Nearly all of the Salter siblings also lost a spouse when they were young. So because of this, they tended to move what was left of their families into one household and all live together. I like to call it the conglomerate Salter household. And the way it worked is usually Elizabeth Evans was there with or without her children. Kate Breathitt Salter Smith was also there. And then the third sibling would switch out. So in 1900, the third sibling who was there was actually Carrie Salter, who had not yet married. She was the baby of the Salter family, but soon after 1900, she went on to marry Dr. House and became Carrie House, who was involved in probably one of the most well-known and dramatic Cayce readings. By 1910, she was gone because she had married. Gertrude, William, Porter, and Milton had also all moved out of the house. So it was really just Elizabeth Evans, Kate Salter Smith, cousin Teddie, who was 30 years old at this time. And then Elizabeth and Kate's brother had moved in because his wife had died 1 year before. So their brother William was there with his two children, Willie Lee and Gray Salter, who will be our second case study. So Estella never married. According to Gladys Davis, Estella had told her at one point that she had wanted to marry and she had someone she was deeply in love with, but Kate, her stepmother, either didn't approve of him or just didn't want to leave her stepdaughter at all. And so Estella really set aside what she wanted for her life and stayed with her stepmother for the rest of both of their lives. And this was slightly unusual. Though it was becoming more common for women to lead single lives in the early 20th century, it was still not normal. Women were seen as belonging to the domestic sphere and needing to be cared for by a man. And in the South in particular, which Kentucky in culture is Southern, um, women from like middle and upper class families would not have been expected to go out and get jobs, and they would have really been discouraged against doing this. It was seen as very, very inappropriate. So there were only a few jobs that it was okay for middle class women to have at the time. They could be governesses or teachers, or they could work inside their own home doing like sewing repairs for people or something like this. So this situation ends up putting women in a situation where they're always dependent on someone else to take care of their material needs because they can't produce income. And so you could probably, if you were a woman, rely on your parents to take care of you, but they're probably going to die before you. And after that, you really are going to have to throw yourself on the good nature and generosity of your siblings and extended family. And this didn't always work out well. So it was kind of a precarious position to be in. In Estella's life reading, Edgar described her as one who's considered peculiar by many in its action and its thought, one that is in the influence of love's forces ever. I love that quote, one that is in the influence of love's forces ever. And I think that that's a really good way to describe Estella Smith's personality and her actions throughout her life. So in her role as an unmarried woman, we've already seen that she was peculiar for the time. The second half of this assessment for me seems to be even more true. She was a loving daughter, sister, and aunt who I think always put the needs of her family in front of her own. In fact, when she participated in a cantata as a teenager, the character in which she was cast, you can see over here on the right, was Love. So in this lifetime, it seems as though her exceptional gift of love was really directed wholly towards her adopted family. Her stepmother, Kate, leaned heavily on her throughout her life. Another thing that made her peculiar was that she was very well educated. During a time when it was unusual for most people, male or female, to even finish eighth grade, cousin Teddie went on to college for 2 years. Her relationship with her cousin Gertrude was another matter that came up multiple times in her life reading. It turns out that in all three of the past lives that were mentioned in Estella's life reading, she was with her cousin Gertrude. Both were in the royal household in France when Charles II of England was in exile. They were together in Persia for the start of Zoroastrianism, and they were also together in Egypt. In the current life, the two grew up in the same household, really more like sisters than like cousins. Edgar noted that Estella's particular attention to dress also came from her lifetime in the royal court in France. And you can see she is always the best dressed in the crowd. So Estella Smith died in October of 1943, age 63. She had been suffering from a cancer of the womb for, I think, 14 years at least, and she was sincerely mourned by her family. Just 3 months before her death, there's a letter from her cousin Tommy House to Edgar that's really written about her painful condition. And in it, Tommy says, "It just seems hard to understand why a person like her should merit a fate like this." Three exclamation points and a question mark. So her family was very, very grieved at her suffering. Estella herself had referred to her life as a vale of tears. And so I think probably one of the most comforting things from the Edgar Cayce readings for her was that in one of her readings, Edgar told her that she did not need to return to the earth plane after this life for continued soul growth. Our second case study is Gray Salter, who you've already met very briefly as a 2-year-old in the extended Salter household. So Gray was born in February of 1908 in Hopkinsville to William Salter and his wife Lillian Gray. His birth was a little bit unusual. His parents had already been married for 17 years at that point and had one other child. So William was 43 when Gray was born, and his mother Lillian was 39. I think you could say he was probably a surprise baby. His mother died just 15 months after he was born, and I couldn't find out why. There wasn't a death certificate for her. But this loss is definitely referenced in his life reading given by Edgar, in which Edgar states, "We find one then that seemed as handicapped in many respects through environmental conditions." So, as we've already mentioned earlier, after his wife's death, William took his 2 kids and moved in with his sisters, Elizabeth and Kate. So in 1910, when we look at the census, which I should have put a census record on here and didn't, you've got cousin Teddie, Estella, 30 years old, living in the same household as Gray, her 2-year-old step cousin. When Gray was 18, he was trying to decide what he wanted to do for a living. And at that point in time, he got a life reading from Edgar, I think probably with the hopes of getting some career direction from it. And I think that you can pick up very decisive inklings of what his career path would go on to be through this life reading. The earliest life mentioned in the reading was in Atlantis, and I think that this one bears out the most in both of Gray's careers. He was an electrician first and then became a policeman. So in Atlantis, he was involved in making explosives. The Atlanteans had just gotten this technology um, and were trying to figure it out, and he was one of the ones who was the best at that. According to Cayce, the entity gained in that period through the ability to take orders, and as is seen in the present experience, that desire to know something of every mechanical device. The ability to take orders, I think, is a direct correlation to his career as a policeman. And then obviously, mechanical devices and engineering go hand in hand. He also mentioned a life in France from which, quote, the entity dislikes the rule of power of uprising, yet is ever in accord with those already in power. Edgar also noted that Gray was temperamental, held a grudge, and was one who could easily figure out how mechanical things worked, but quickly forgot what he had learned. At 22 years old, we have the 1930s census right here. You can see Gray Salter living in the Cayce Hospital. So he had moved to Virginia Beach and was employed working at the Cayce Hospital as an engineer and an electrician. By 1940, he was back in Hopkinsville, living in the conglomerate Salter household again, at this point composed of his aunt, Kate Smith, Milton, who I guess was going by Raymond at the time, Estella, Carrie House, who had been widowed and moved home to Hopkinsville from Virginia Beach, and then Gray. I didn't put the whole record up because it was too long, but at this point, he was a state trooper. He did not stay in the household very long because in 1942 he married a woman named Margaret Adcock and moved out into his own house and had one child with her named William after his father. So Grace Salter's job placed him really at the scene of the crime in Hopkinsville and Christian County's most memorable event of the 20th century, which was the Kelly Green Man incident. This was one of the earliest well-documented extraterrestrial encounters in America. And if you know anything about the 1950s and 60s, those are two decades when these become very commonplace. And there's really like a rage about green men. So the term green men actually comes from what happened in Kelly. So this happened when Gray Salter was working for the city of Hopkinsville as a policeman. And as some of you may not be super familiar with this story, I'm just going to go through it one step at a time because it is very interesting. So the scene is a Hopkinsville police station, August 21st, 1955, 11 p.m. It's been a pretty quiet night when out of the dark, two cars careen into the lot and 12 people, including 7 children, spill out of them and into the station. They're led by 2 men, Lucky Sutton and Billy Ray Taylor, who are in both of these photographs, but I don't know which is which. They're all in an extreme state of excitement. Sutton and Taylor begin to tell their story, and it's pretty unbelievable. They've just come down from Kelly, which is a farming community just to the north of Hopkinsville, and they've been engaged for the past 4 hours in a shootout with little men who came out of a flying saucer. According to them, around 7 o'clock, one of them had gone into the backyard to use the water pump. And when he was out there, he noticed a flying saucer land in the field behind him. And so he ran back into the house, but was able to see 12 or 15 short men, probably about 4 feet tall, that he described as having large ears, huge eyes, and very long arms emerge from the saucer. They came up to the house's window and began peering in. And so Sutton and Taylor did what you might expect a Kentucky tenant farmer to do. They grabbed their guns and started firing. When the aliens retreated, Sutton and Taylor had cautiously emerged from the house to take stock of the surrounding area. A huge hand reached down from the roof and grabbed Taylor by the hair. And at the same time, they noticed that there was another one of the little men up in a tree. And Sutton blasted a third with his shotgun, which is when they discovered that the shots didn't really do anything to the aliens. They did retreat, but they didn't seem to be harmed at all. So they continued doing this for 3 or 4 hours, really to no avail, when they decided that they needed reinforcements and went down to Hopkinsville for the police. So first responders to the scene were 4 of the city police, including Gray Salter. On their way to Kelly, the police radioed for support. They took the situation very seriously. And so there ended up being, I think, 7 to 10 police on the scene, where they investigated and found one hole in a screen door from probably Taylor's first gunshot, but nothing else, and left. The next morning, Sutton and Taylor reported to them that the little men had returned around 3:30 a.m. for another attack. There was more investigation, but they never really found anything out about what had happened. But this event, for me, and I think for most of the people living in Hopkinsville and Christian County at the time, was just bizarre and probably the most interesting thing that happened here during the 20th century. And Gray Salter was in the middle of it. So he died young. He was only 52 years old. He died in July of 1962 of a myocardial infarction. And his wife, Margaret, who was actually about 10 years younger than him, also died unexpectedly about 1 year after him. For our final case study, we're going to leave Hopkinsville altogether and talk about Julia Chandler, who is a very, very interesting person. I started doing research on Julia Chandler because one of my friends, Matthew Brooks, was doing a presentation on her that came from her life reading, an Edgar Cayce presentation. So he wanted to know what the rest of her life was like. And so I started to look into her, and she just, for me, I think is one of the most fascinating people that I have ever researched. So Julia Chandler in 1937 requested a reading from Edgar Cayce. At the time, she was 57 years old. She was a widow, and she was living alone in New York City, working as a radio host and an observation deck manager for the Empire State Building, which had only been opened 4 years before in 1933. So Cayce listed 3 past lives for Julia. The first one he talked about was a servant girl, Clementine, in the early Byrd household in Virginia. The second one was Judy from the Essene community. If you're not familiar with Judy, she was integral to the coming of Christ. She was really the head of the Essene group from which Mary, the mother of Jesus, came. And she was a very, very gifted leader, teacher, prophet, healer, and historian. And then the third life reading was a Persian princess who had gone to study in the Temple Beautiful in Egypt. So that's really interesting. But once you start to look at who Julia Chandler was in this life, it gets even more interesting. A quick look at her life reveals that she was a sensitive and talented individual who was very good at the art of communication, which she practiced and enjoyed. It also reveals a life of a lot of loss in close relationships. And I think that these losses, however painful, seem to have lent her a really great strength in the latter part of her life. Julia Chandler was born in Bowling Green, Virginia on the 5th of May, 1880, which, if you're keeping track of dates, was one day before cousin Estella was born. She was the fifth child and the only daughter of Algernon and Julia Chandler. And Algernon worked as a lawyer. You can see this census record up here from 1880. She's 1 month old when the census taker comes to look at the household, and Algernon's up here. He's a lawyer. Julia, her mother, and then her 4 brothers. When she was just 2 years old, her oldest brother, Temple, tragically went through the ice while skating and drowned. She probably didn't remember this incident at all since she was so young, but it's doubtless one that cast some sort of shadow over her childhood and home life growing up. Her parents would go on to have one more child after her, and it was a little girl. They named her Edith Temple. So she was named for the brother that she would never meet. I wasn't able to find out much about Julia's childhood or education, but I did find that she married for the first time at the age of 18. This is her marriage announcement from the newspaper. She married a man named Ellis French, who was just a couple years older than her and was also from Bowling Green, Virginia. He worked as a bookkeeper and then salesman for a tobacco company. The couple had two children, a son named Algernon in 1899 and a daughter named Dorothy in 1900. During this time, Julia seems to have lived like most middle-class mothers at that time, really tucked away at home, occupied entirely in the domestic sphere. But this changed dramatically when her marriage ended less than 10 years later. By 1907, Julia and Ellis had divorced, which was highly unusual for the time. She and the children had moved to Chicago, and this seems to be the point when Julia Chandler first made an attempt at professional writing and succeeded. The 1910 census lists her as a fiction writer. In 1907, she married for the second time to a Midwestern illustrator named Robert Mance. That same year, her closest brother in age, Ferdinand, who was 31 at the time, died unexpectedly of pneumonia. He was just 31 and had a wife and two young children. So the Mance family did not stay in Chicago for very long. By the summer of 1912, they were back east, living in Washington, D.C., and both she and Robert were employed by the Washington Herald. Robert worked as an illustrator, and Julia wrote two separate columns, one on women's interests and the other reviewing plays. Tragically, in 1913, Julia's 13-year-old son Algernon died. He had been sick for nearly 5 months, and this loss was absolutely traumatic for her, and questions about her son Algernon continue to arise in her readings with Edgar Cayce 25 years later. It may have also impacted her other relationships because by 1915, she and Robert seemed to have separated. So Julia Chandler had not one failed marriage, but two in a period in time in which people were extremely judgmental and not at all forgiving about this kind of thing. They did not divorce, though. In January of 1919, Robert Mance was living on his own in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and he died of influenza. His death notice listed that he was survived by his mother and his siblings, but it makes no mention at all of Julia and doesn't even talk about a wife or family. So I think we can glean from that that the marriage was definitely finished by that point in time. Later in some readings that she got from Cayce, I think Julia may have been thinking on her two failed marriages when she asked, "Why do I get so little love, consideration, and appreciation from those to whom I pour out the most service and devotion?" And then she also went on to ask, "Who is my real mate?" Both really poignant questions, knowing her history. By 1920, Julia Chandler, who had dropped the name Mance and reverted back to her maiden name, which she would use for the rest of her life, was living alone in an apartment in New York City. In the readings, both she and Edgar both spoke about her loneliness, but I see this period in her life as a period in which Julia Chandler really blossomed into the person that she could be and used her talents. On her own, she continued writing, but she also branched out into image management for show businesses and department stores. She got into radio broadcasting, in which the readings reveal that she saw a means in which she thought she could do real good for a lot of people. In July 1936, she became the Empire State Building's observatory manager. This is a picture of the observatory deck at the Empire State Building. It's terrifying. I think the picture's from the 40s or maybe early 50s, but you can see it's like an open deck. So imagine having to manage the general public up here. Kind of a daunting task. And I think she was probably referring to this when she said to Edgar, I am at present doing quantities of routine stuff that any intelligent person could do as well, while my real gifts are folded away in a napkin through no apparent fault of my own. This job really taxed her and she did not enjoy it. But Cayce's response to this was very typical for Cayce. He told her that by just being patient and kind in her duties, she was renewing a righteous purpose within. I can't help but maybe think that the reference to her lifetime as Clementine, the servant girl, had to do with this job and came up because of her employment in this task that she didn't enjoy, but in which she was really serving the general public. During this time, she was also able to do some radio broadcasting, which she did enjoy. And one broadcast that is very well documented that she participated in a lot was called Microphone in the Sky. This actually aired from the observation deck of the Empire State Building with a live audience. Chandler was known to be able to keep her cool in stressful situations. Once, right before the broadcast was about to begin, someone actually climbed up on the edge and jumped to their death. And 1 minute later, the broadcast started, but Julia Chandler was able to keep the audience calm enough that nobody mentioned the suicide during the entire broadcast. She was a little bit of a daredevil too. She climbed to the top of the antenna on the Empire State Building at the age of 57 and was the first woman to do so. So she went on to have a number of readings, and she often asked numerous and very detailed questions about her career trajectory and how she could apply that to doing real good in the world, especially with radio broadcasting. Edgar's main advice was always to broadcast truth and love. In her radio work, Edgar saw Julia as drawing on her experiences as Judy. He saw a direct correlation between her radio programs and Judy's teaching in what he called the hopes to put into the word of the day, the experience of the day, in all phases of human experience, lessons, symbols, yea, tenets that will drive, as it were, home in those periods when the soul takes the thought and counsel with itself as to whence the experiences of the day are leading. These abilities are there. Use them. From an outside perspective, I think there are other really striking similarities between Judy and Julia. They both had diverse talents from which they drew on as leaders. And as far as we know, they both remained single for the rest of their lives. I think Julia Chandler didn't really even come into herself until she became single, although we know from the readings that she always longed to find her true mate. I don't know whether she ever did find her true mate or the answers to many of her questions, but Edgar Cayce's words and relationship, I think, must have really resonated with her because by 1950, we find her in the census in Virginia Beach. She's left New York City and moved to Virginia Beach, where she was listed as a magazine writer. She was writing articles for the ARE Bulletin. So Julia Chandler died in Westchester County, New York in 1966. So that gives you a little taste of just what I've been trying to do, kind of using history and historical documents side by side with the Edgar Cayce materials to kind of provide a fuller picture